It whispered through the sagebrush, whistled across the split-rail fences, and rattled the tin roof of Wade Hollister's ranch house like a restless ghost looking for a place to rest. Evening light bled over the horizon, red as fire on old gun barrels, and the whole world seemed to pause, empty, wide, and waiting. Wade stood on the porch, one hand resting on the rail, the other holding a tin cup gone cold long ago. His broad shoulders were hunched beneath a worn wool coat, the kind soldiers used to wear back in the war. His beard had gone to gray around the jaw, and deep lines framed his eyes, carved there by wind and grief more than time. He wasn't a man who spoke much anymore. There hadn't been a reason to, not since Mary died. Behind him, the house stood quiet and small, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen. Inside, the smell of dust had long replaced the smell of bread she used to bake. The table still held 2 chairs, but only one ever moved. A thin shawl, faded blue, hung on the peg by the door. He never had the heart to take it down. Every night, Wade sat alone by the fire, listening to the boards creak under the weight of memories. Mary's laughter still echoed there, soft as the wind through wheat. She'd been the only warmth this place ever had. When the fever took her 3 winters ago, he'd buried her under a cottonwood beside the creek, the same one she used to sit beneath when the air turned sweet with spring. He remembered that day clear as daylight, the way her hair blew across her face as he lowered her down, the way his shovel cut into the frozen ground. He'd carved her name into a slab of oak, but the rain had worn it smooth. Now only the tree remembered her. Since then, life had shrunk down to chores and silence. Wade worked the land by habit, not hope. He mended fences, fed the horses, checked the traps by the ridge. The town folks down in Larkspur called him the Ghost Rancher, said he'd gone mad from losing her. Maybe they were right. Sometimes he caught himself talking to her when he saddled the horse, as if she still might answer. That evening, the light stretched long and gold across the prairie. The air smelled of dry earth and snow waiting in the clouds. Wade watched the sun drop behind the distant buttes, a burning coin sinking into sand. He drank what was left of his coffee, the taste bitter and cold, and stepped back inside. He lit the oil lamp on the table. Its glow caught dust floating in the air like tiny ghosts. The silence felt heavy, too heavy, and for the 100th night, he wondered why he was still here. There were men in town who'd sold their land and drifted south, chasing warmth and whiskey. Wade stayed because leaving felt like betrayal, and he'd had his fill of that in the war. The storm came sudden. A low growl of thunder rolled across the valley, and the wind picked up sharp enough to bite. Snow began to fall, slow at first, then harder, thick flakes driven sideways by the gale. It slammed against the windows, howling down the chimney like some wild thing set loose. He threw another log on the fire, pulled his coat tight, and checked the latch on the door. Nights like this could kill a man, or anything foolish enough to be out in it. Then he heard it, faint, almost swallowed by the wind, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, a low, broken cry. Not a coyote, not the hinge of a loose gate, something human. He froze, every muscle tight. For a long moment, the only thing he could hear was the wind tearing across the plains. Then it came again, weaker this time. He reached for the lantern and his shotgun, though he didn't know why. Habit, maybe. Out here, you didn't take chances. The cold hit him like a hammer when he stepped outside. The snow came at him in sheets, blinding white against the dark. He moved slow, boots crunching through the drift, the light from his lantern flickering in the wind. The sound came from near the barn. He rounded the corner, heart thudding steady, breath turning to frost in front of his beard. The horses shifted restlessly inside, their hooves stamping against the boards. And then, there under the cedar by the barn wall, he saw her, a figure half buried in snow. He lowered the lantern. The light fell across a girl, no, a young woman, her skin copper-toned, her hair tangled with ice and dust. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and blood had frozen dark along her arm. Barefoot, shaking. For a second, Wade thought she was dead. Then she stirred, barely. A ragged breath escaped her lips. He knelt beside her, his breath catching. She was Apache. He could tell by the braids, the beads woven into her hair, the faint paint smudge near her cheek. He hadn't seen an Apache this close since before the army cleared the reservation lands. Most folks in town spoke their name like a curse, but Wade didn't move. He just stared down at her, unsure whether he was looking at a lost soul or some spirit the wind had carried to his door. The storm screamed around them, pulling at his coat. He should have turned away, should have left her. That's what any man with sense would do. But sense had long left him. He set the shotgun aside and slid his arms beneath her shoulders. She was light, too light. The cold had stolen her weight. When he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest, dark hair spilling across his coat. She smelled faintly of wood smoke and river water, like the wild itself. Wade carried her toward the cabin, boots sinking deep in the snow. The wind clawed at him, the lantern swinging wildly, but he didn't stop. Inside, the heat hit him like a wall. He laid her near the hearth and pulled a wool blanket from the bed, the one he never used. She didn't wake. Her lips were pale, cracked. Her skin burned with fever even through the cold. He crouched beside her, staring into the fire. His hands trembled, though not from the chill. He hadn't touched another living soul since Mary's hand slipped from his 3 years ago. Now here was this stranger, this wounded girl lying on his floor, the world outside howling like it wanted her back. He poured water into a tin basin, warmed it by the fire, and cleaned the blood from her arm. The gash was deep but clean. Not an animal bite, knife maybe. He stitched it the way he used to stitch soldiers in field tents, slow and steady, the firelight painting shadows on his face. She flinched once, a faint sound leaving her throat, something between a word and a prayer. When he finished, he sat back, wiped his hands on a rag and stared at her face. She was young, no more than 20. There was something fierce even in her stillness, like a hawk mid-flight, wings waiting to open. Outside, the storm showed no mercy. The wind battered the walls, snow piling against the window ledge. Inside, the fire hissed, the only sound in the world besides her breathing. Wade leaned against the wall, exhaustion pressing on him. His eyes lingered on the girl. He didn't know what she was running from, or who might come looking, but he knew one thing. The land had brought her here for a reason, maybe mercy, maybe trouble. He reached out, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The firelight glowed across her face, softening the lines of pain there. For a long while he just sat there, listening to the storm tear across Dry Hollow. And somewhere between one gust and the next he heard himself whisper, "Easy now. You're safe here." The words hung in the air like smoke, foreign, fragile, almost forgotten. He hadn't said them to anyone since the night Mary died. Outside, the blizzard howled on, but inside, beneath the flicker of that lone fire, something in Wade Hollister's heart cracked open, quiet as snow falling on a grave. Snow hissed against the window panes, and the wind prowled around the cabin like a hungry wolf. The fire burned low, throwing red and gold light across the log walls and the two figures inside, one still, one watchful. Wade Hollister sat cross-legged near the hearth, a needle and thread glinting between his fingers. The young woman lay stretched out on a blanket beside the fire, her arm bound with a strip of clean linen. Her breathing had steadied since he'd stitched the wound, though every now and then a tremor ran through her shoulders. He didn't ask questions. Out here, questions didn't save lives. He dipped the needle again, the motion automatic, steady, precise, the way he used to work in field tents back in the war. Her skin was warm to the touch now, feverish, and the cut ran deep along her forearm, the edges ragged but clean. Whoever had done it hadn't meant to kill her, just to stop her. When he finished, he sat back on his heels. His hands, scarred and weathered, hovered in the firelight before he wiped them on a rag. He caught himself looking at her face, the sharp cheekbones, the smudge of dirt along her jaw, the faint blue vein beneath one temple. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes trembling like the wings of a trapped bird. For a heartbeat, Wade thought she'd slip away again, but then her eyes opened. They were dark, deep brown, wild and wary, like a doe cornered in brush. She looked at him, not with trust, not yet, but with the fierce alertness of someone used to fighting for breath. Wade raised his hands slightly, palms open. "It's all right," he said, voice rough from disuse. "You're safe. No one's coming tonight." Her eyes darted toward the door, then back to him. She said something, short, sharp, words that carried the rhythm of another world. Apache. Wade didn't understand the meaning, but he understood the tone. Defiance mixed with confusion. He shook his head slowly, pointed toward the fire. "Warm yourself," he murmured. The girl hesitated, then shifted closer to the flames. The blanket slipped from her shoulder, revealing the jagged line of stitches running down her arm. She touched the bandage lightly, then looked back at him. He poured water from the kettle into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Drink," he said. For a long moment she didn't move. Then cautiously she took it. The metal trembled in her hands as she brought it to her lips. She drank only a little, wincing at the heat, then set the cup down. Wade watched her, not unkindly. "You've been out a while," he said softly. "You're lucky the cold didn't finish what that knife started." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing, not understanding. But his tone must have reached her, because the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly. The clock on the mantel ticked faintly, counting seconds neither of them were sure they owned. The storm kept screaming, battering the cabin walls with icy fists. Wade stood, fetched a plate from the cupboard, and placed a few scraps of cornbread and jerky on it. He set it near her on the floor, careful not to crowd her. "You'll need something in your belly," he said. The girl stared at the food, unmoving. Her fingers twitched once, then again. Slowly she reached for the bread, sniffed it, and took a bite. Small, cautious, like an animal testing a trap. She chewed in silence, her eyes flicking toward him between mouthfuls. Wade turned back to the fire, pretending not to notice. The quiet stretched long and low, broken only by the pop of sap in the logs and the sigh of the wind outside. Wade poured himself coffee, though it tasted more like ash than comfort. He sat by the table, boots planted firm on the floorboards, staring at nothing. He tried not to look at her again, but he couldn't help it. There was something in the way she sat, shoulders squared, even while exhausted, that reminded him of Mary. Not her face, not her softness, but the way she carried pain without flinching. For years he'd lived surrounded by silence. Tonight that silence felt different, less empty, more alive. The girl finished the bread and curled up by the hearth, pulling the blanket tight around her. Her eyes closed almost instantly. In minutes, her breathing evened out again. Wade stayed where he was. The fire threw her shadow long across the floorboards, small, fragile, yet stubbornly present. He set the coffee down and leaned back in the chair, fingers tapping the edge of his shotgun resting against his leg. He wasn't expecting trouble, not tonight. But the world had a cruel way of sending it anyway. For hours he sat that way, half awake, half dreaming, his mind flickering through old memories. The war, the graves, Mary's soft hands pulling splinters from his skin. The way she'd smile and say, "You're more stubborn than the land itself." Maybe that's why he was still here. Too stubborn to quit, even when everything worth holding had slipped away. The fire burned down to coals. Outside, the storm raged and broke against the hills. Inside, the warmth pressed close, thick and dim. Wade's eyes grew heavy. He told himself he'd just rest a minute, that he'd keep watch until daylight. But when he blinked next, the fire had turned to embers, and the wind had gone quiet. The first gray light of dawn slipped through the cracks in the shutters. The room was cold again, though not as cold as the night before. Wade stirred in his chair, joints stiff, and glanced toward the hearth. The blanket was empty. For a second, his heart kicked hard in his chest. Then he saw her, standing by the window, small against the pale light, wrapped in his coat. She turned when he moved, her expression unreadable. The faint color of morning brushed her cheekbones, softening the harshness there. On the table beside her sat the empty plate and the cup he'd given her, washed clean and set upside down to dry. The blanket she'd used was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. She looked at him, silent. Not frightened this time, not even uncertain. Just aware. He rubbed a hand across his face, unsure what to say. The words felt foreign in his mouth. "You still here?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold something older than her years. For a long moment, Neither of them said a thing. The only sound was the soft creak of the floorboards as the cabin settled around them. Then Wade nodded once, slow and small. "Guess I'm not used to company." He expected no reply, and got none. But something shifted between them in that quiet morning light. It wasn't friendship yet, wasn't trust, just the first fragile thread of understanding, stretched thin across the cold room. Wade moved toward the stove, poured the last of the coffee into his cup. It tasted just as bitter as always, but he felt the warmth of it this time. Outside, the sky was clearing, blue creeping back into the world after the long white night. The snow glistened across the prairie like spilled salt. He looked out the window, watching the wind lift small curls of snow off the fence posts. The girl followed his gaze, stepping closer to the glass. For a brief second, their reflections stood side by side in the frosted pane. Two strangers bound by accident and storm, both scarred in their own ways, both unsure what tomorrow would bring. Wade set down his cup and turned away, the ghost of a sigh caught in his chest. "There's chores to do," he said quietly. "Wood won't split itself." She didn't answer, but when he stepped outside a moment later, he heard movement behind him. The soft scrape of bare feet across the floor, the whisper of her breath as she settled near the fire again. For the first time in years, Wade realized he wasn't entirely alone. And for reasons he couldn't name, the thought made the world outside seem just a little less empty. By the second morning, the land had settled back into silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost holy. Snow clung to the fence rails and shimmered in the sun like ground glass. From the porch, Wade Hollister could see the line of the hills clear again, every rock sharp against the blue. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and boiled coffee. The girl was sitting near the fire, wrapped in one of his blankets, the color finally returning to her face. Wade moved quietly, pouring water into a tin basin, pretending not to notice the way her eyes followed him. He still didn't know what to call her. He figured if she'd wanted him to ask, she would have said so. Out here, a person's name wasn't given easy. It was earned. When he handed her the basin to wash, she looked up at him and spoke softly, her accent thick but clear. "Akacheta," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "My name." He nodded once. "Akacheta," he repeated, careful with the sound. It rolled rough in his throat. She smiled faintly, the first he'd seen from her. "It means," she paused, searching for the word, "the one who rises after battle." Wade set the kettle down. "Seems that fits." Her smile faded as quickly as it came. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the wind pushed at the snow in little ghostly curls. She hesitated, then began speaking again, slowly, haltingly. "Men came," she said. "Riders. White men. They came in the night." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. "They burned the lodges, took the horses, my mother, my brother." Her voice trailed off. Wade didn't say anything. He could hear the story in the spaces between her words. "I ran," she whispered finally. "Ran into the cold. I thought maybe the spirits would hide me." The fire popped. The sound made her flinch, then fall silent again. Wade poured coffee into a second cup and set it on the floor near her. He didn't meet her eyes. "You don't owe me your story," he said simply. Akacheta looked up, startled. She studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of it. Then she nodded, grateful, almost relieved. For a while, neither spoke. The wind outside shifted, brushing against the cabin walls like a sigh. The days that followed passed in quiet rhythm. Wade went about his chores, and she moved through the small cabin like a shadow, soft-footed, quick, and watchful. She swept the floors, kept the fire fed, mended one of his torn shirts with thread she found in a drawer. She didn't ask, and he didn't stop her. In return, he fixed the broken latch on the window, brought in extra firewood, and showed her how to split kindling with the smaller axe. The silence between them began to change. It wasn't heavy anymore, not the kind that pressed on the chest like grief. It felt like a shared language, unspoken but understood. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the world turned the color of rust, Wade sat sharpening his knife on the porch steps. Akacheta came out, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. She handed him one without a word, then sat beside him. watching the dying light over the valley. For a long time, neither moved. The only sound was the rasp of steel against stone. After a while, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "In my tongue," she said, "this is Hozhu, the quiet before the dark." He glanced over. "What's it mean?" She took a sip of coffee, thinking. "It means peace, maybe, or balance." He nodded, turning the knife in his hands. "Don't see much of that around here." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Maybe now you do." He didn't answer, but she was right. The land didn't feel so hollow anymore. Over time, they began trading words the way folks might trade goods. She'd point at something and name it in Apache. Two for grass, dine for holy, ta for water. He'd repeat after her, clumsy and slow. Then he'd teach her in return. Coffee, nail, horse, home. She laughed once when he mispronounced one of her words, the sound bright and sudden. Wade looked up from the stove, caught off guard. He hadn't heard laughter in this cabin since Mary's voice faded into the wind. "Guess I'm not much for languages," he said, half smiling. "You learn fast," she replied. "You listen." He shrugged. "Listening's easier than talking." The nights grew softer after that. The cold still crept under the door, but the fire always seemed to burn a little warmer. She'd hum low tunes while she worked, songs without words, and sometimes he'd find himself humming along without even knowing the tune. They were two strangers living under the same roof, but the space between them had begun to feel less like distance and more like something shared. Out behind the house there was an old oak tree, twisted and wide, its bark silvered with age. Mary had planted wildflowers around it once, bluebells and prairie daisies that came up every spring. Wade had stopped tending them after she died. The earth had claimed them back. Now every evening, Apache would sit beneath that tree as the sun went down, watching the horizon. She said nothing, did nothing, just sat there, letting the wind move through her hair. Wade would sometimes stand in the doorway watching her. The light touched her face in a way that reminded him of all the things he'd buried. Love, hope, the will to speak. He realized that the same silence that had once broken him was slowly putting him back together. Maybe that's what Mary would have wanted, someone to fill the quiet without changing it. That night he lit a fire early. The sky outside turned black fast, clouds rolling in from the west. The wind came up sharp, carrying the scent of rain and distant thunder. Inside, Apache stirred a pot of stew. Wade sat at the table, carving a new handle for his pocket knife. The air felt heavy, like something unseen was drawing near. When the first gust hit the cabin walls, she went to the window. The wind tangled her hair, the firelight painting her silhouette against the glass. "They'll come for me," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. Wade looked up. "What's that?" She didn't turn around. "The men, the ones who burned my camp. They'll come. I know it." He rose from his chair slowly, his shadow stretching across the floor. "You sure about that?" "Yes." Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the window pane. "They don't leave things undone." Wade moved closer, his boots heavy on the boards. When he stopped beside her, their reflections stood side by side in the dark glass, the ghost and the girl. "Then they'll find me here too," he said. His voice was steady, simple. Apache looked up at him, startled. There was something unspoken in her gaze. Fear, yes, but also something like trust. Outside, the wind roared across the plains, bending the oak tree near the porch. Inside, the fire snapped bright, and for the first time since that stormy night, Wade felt the house come alive again. That night, as the thunder rolled over Dry Hollow, Wade sat near the door with his rifle laid across his knees. He wasn't sure if danger would come tomorrow, or next week, or ever. But for once, it didn't matter. He wasn't just guarding his land anymore. He was guarding a heartbeat. And somewhere deep in the quiet, he realized that the ghost of his past had stopped haunting him. Not because it was gone, but because it finally had company. The morning came gray and still, the kind that fooled a man into thinking peace might last another day. Wade Hollister stepped out onto his porch with his coat pulled tight and the rifle slung over one shoulder. The storm had cleared, leaving a frozen silence behind it. The prairie glittered under a thin sheet of ice, the snow crusted hard enough to crunch beneath his boots. His breath rose white in the dawn. He was heading for the barn when he noticed it. The ground didn't look right. The snow, once smooth and untouched, was cut up with half-moons and craters. He crouched down, brushing his hand over the surface. Hoof prints. Dozens of them. Maybe more. They circled the house, tight and deliberate. Whoever made them had moved under cover of night. A slow chill crawled through his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He followed the trail toward the ridge, and as the first streaks of sunlight broke over the horizon, he saw movement. Shadows on horseback, lined along the rise like a wall of ghosts against the pale sky. Then the sound came, low and heavy, the breathing of horses, the faint jingle of reins. 70 riders. Maybe more. Wade's fingers found the edge of his rifle but didn't lift it. Not yet. From among them, one man rode forward. He was older, his posture proud and straight as a pine. His face was painted in streaks of red and black, the colors of blood and ash. A thick wolf pelt hung from his shoulders, the fur stirring in the wind. The others held their ground behind him, silent as stone. Akacheta appeared in the cabin doorway, wrapped in a blanket, her hair undone, eyes wide. When she saw the rider, her lips parted in a whisper. "Father." Wade didn't move. He just watched the man descend the slope, hooves sinking into the snow, breath rising from the horses in thick clouds. When the rider stopped 20 paces away, he dismounted with the grace of someone born to the saddle. He walked forward until he stood in the circle of light between sun and shadow. "You sheltered her," he said. His voice was deep, rough like river stones. Wade nodded once. "I did." The man studied him, gaze steady and unblinking. The lines on his face weren't just from age. They were from command. This was a man used to being obeyed. "You know who she is?" he asked. "I do now," Wade said quietly. "And you know what that means?" "I reckon I do." The man's jaw tightened, though his hand never went near the knife at his belt. He didn't need to. Power hung off him like a shadow. Behind him, the other riders fanned out in a slow, perfect arc, their horses stamping the ground in rhythm. The sound echoed like distant thunder. Akacheta stepped forward from the porch. "Father," she said again, louder this time. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Even the wind went still. Tyan turned toward her, and the stern lines of his face softened, if only for an instant. "You live," he said in Apache, his tone not quite surprise, not quite relief. "I do," she answered, her voice trembling. "Because of him." She nodded toward Wade. Tyan's gaze returned to the rancher. "You could have left her to the cold." "I could have," Wade said. "Didn't." The older man's eyes narrowed. He took a slow step forward, boots sinking deep into the snow. "You think she belongs to you now?" Wade shook his head. "Ain't no one belongs to anyone." The words hung there, hot in the cold air. Akacheta's breath hitched, as though she understood that sentence better than either of them. The Apache warriors shifted slightly, their ponies snorting, restless but silent. They were waiting for a sign, a command, anything. But Tyan didn't raise his hand. He didn't even blink. Instead, he studied Wade the way one might study an enemy too proud to kneel. "You've got courage," he said finally. "Or foolishness. Sometimes they're the same." "Most days," Wade replied, "they are." A flicker of something, respect maybe, passed through Tyan's eyes. "3 sons," he said at last, his voice carrying like a drumbeat across the field. "That's what you have." Wade frowned. 3 sons? 3 days, Tyan translated. "When the 3rd sun rises, I will come again, not as her father, but as her chief." He turned to Akacheta, and for a brief moment, his voice softened. "You'll remember who you are, daughter. Blood is not washed clean by kindness." Akacheta looked down. "Nor by war," she whispered. But Tyan had already turned away. He mounted his horse in one smooth motion, the wolf pelt flowing over his shoulders. The others followed suit. The line of riders turned as one, their horses moving in a wide circle around the cabin before breaking into a slow trot toward the hills. Snow kicked up under their hooves, catching the light like sparks. Wade stood there until the last of them disappeared over the ridge. Only the sound of hooves remained, fading into the wind. Beside him, Akacheta wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her face was unreadable, her eyes lost somewhere beyond the horizon. "He won't stop," she said quietly. I don't expect him to, Wade answered. She turned to him, voice unsteady. He gave you 3 days. He nodded. Reckon that's 3 more than I deserve. That evening, the sky turned the color of bruised steel. Wade sat at the table cleaning his rifle, though he wasn't sure why. The barn doors were barred, the horses restless in their stalls. Akacheta sat near the window, silent, her hands clasped together in her lap. You ever think about running? Wade asked after a while. She shook her head slowly. Running only delays the storm. He looked up at her, the lamplight catching the reflection of fire in her eyes. He your only kin left? Yes. She hesitated. He is my father, but he is also Tayan, chief of what remains of our people. He carries their anger, their dead, their pride. Wade sighed, setting the rifle aside. Ain't much different from men I knew in the war. She studied him, curiosity flickering beneath her fear. You fought? He nodded. A long time ago. Thought it was for freedom. Turned out it was mostly for graves. Silence followed, soft but deep. Then Akacheta spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. He will test you, Wade Hollister. He will not come to kill first. He will come to see if you stand. Wade looked toward the fire. Well, he said, he'll find me on my feet. She smiled faintly at that, a sad, knowing smile. The next morning, the sun rose pale and thin through a veil of clouds. The tracks from the night before had frozen solid, circling the ranch like scars. Wade fed the horses, chopped wood, and mended a section of fence the wind had torn loose. Each swing of the axe rang sharp in the still air. Akacheta helped him carry logs to the porch, her movements quiet but sure. They didn't speak much, but the air between them was thick with unspoken things. Fear, gratitude, defiance. Around midday, Wade paused, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cold. He glanced toward the oak tree near the stream, the same one Mary had loved. Akacheta stood there now, watching the land the way Mary once did, her hair lifting in the breeze. For the first time since she'd come, he realized he didn't see her as a burden. She was part of this place now, as much as the soil and the wind. Still, her father's words haunted him. 3 sons, 3 days to choose who he would be, the man who hid or the man who stood. That night, he dreamed of fire. He saw Mary's face fading into smoke, heard the thunder of hooves, smelled blood on the wind. When he woke, his heart was pounding, his hands gripping the rifle by the bed. The wind outside was rising again, moaning through the eaves like a warning. He got up, lit the lantern, and went to the window. Out on the plain, the moon cast long shadows across the snow. In the distance, he thought he saw movement, dark shapes far off, too still to be deer. Watching, waiting. He knew then that the 3 days had already begun. The first sun rose over Dry Hollow like a dying ember, soft, pale, and uncertain. Wade Hollister stood by the corral, hammering a loose nail back into the fence post. Each strike echoed through the frozen air, steady as a heartbeat. Beside him, Akacheta hauled a bundle of kindling toward the porch. The two moved in rhythm now, saying little, each knowing where the other would be without having to look. The 3 days Tayan had given him had already begun. Wade could feel them ticking down in his chest, each sunrise a warning and a gift. When the chores were done, he and Akacheta sat by the fire to eat. The stew simmered slow in the pot. Beans, dried corn, a little salted venison from the smokehouse. Wade poured her a cup of coffee, black and bitter the way he'd always liked it, but she grimaced after the first sip, setting it down with a shudder. Too strong? He asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. She nodded. Tastes like burned earth. He smiled faintly. That's about right. Later that morning, she took his hunting knife and showed him how to braid strips of rawhide into a bowstring. Her fingers moved quick, sure, the leather twisting under her touch. Wade tried to follow, fumbling more than once. She laughed softly, the sound like the creek thawing in spring. You tie it like this, she said, leaning closer, her hand guiding his. Tight, or it breaks. Wade glanced at her, brow furrowed. Never thought I'd learn from someone half my size. She looked up, eyes glinting with mischief. Size isn't strength. No, he said. I reckon it ain't. By noon, they had repaired the roof and mended the shutter that the last storm had torn loose. The cabin looked more alive than it had in years. Wade caught himself humming under his breath while working, something Mary used to hum while hanging laundry in the wind. When he realized it, he stopped. But Akacheta picked up the tune, wordless and clear, carrying it softly into the afternoon. That evening, the wind was still. The air smelled of pine smoke and fresh-cut wood. They sat on the porch steps, watching the sun dip behind the hills. Wade poured the last of the day's coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. This time, she didn't grimace. "You make it better now," she said with a small smile. "Maybe I'm learning," he replied. They drank in silence. The snow had begun to melt in small patches, the earth showing through like dark bruises. Wade's dog, an old gray shepherd, padded out from under the porch and lay down between them, sighing deep. The quiet was a kind one, shared, not empty. Akacheta's gaze lingered on the horizon. "You told me once you had a woman," she said. "The one you buried by the creek." Wade's eyes stayed on the hills. "Mary." "Yeah." He didn't speak for a while after that. When he did, his voice was lower, almost gentle. "She got sick the year the drought hit. Nothing I could do. I rode 20 miles for a doctor, but he didn't make it in time. I held her hand till she went cold." He stopped, jaw tightening. "Some things stick, no matter how much time passes." Akacheta's hand moved quietly to his shoulder. "Maybe she sent me here," she said, so softly he almost didn't hear it. He looked at her then, the firelight flickering in her eyes, and for a moment the ache in his chest loosened, just enough to breathe. "Maybe she did," he said. The second sun rose behind a wall of dust. A storm was building somewhere out near the Badlands, the sky a dull bronze. Wade worked faster that day, fixing the barn roof, cleaning the rifle, stacking firewood. Akacheta gathered herbs from near the stream and dried them on the sill, humming as she worked. At midday, she called him inside. A kettle of corn stew simmered on the stove, and beside it sat a small clay bowl filled with something green and sharp-smelling. "What's that?" he asked, sniffing. "Herbs from my people," she said. "They heal. You keep this on your hand. It stops the pain." He looked down at the rough cracks in his knuckles, the old scars from years of rope and wood. "You think I need healing?" She smiled. "Everyone does." He chuckled under his breath, but when she turned away, he dabbed a bit on his skin. The scent was wild and earthy, and for some reason, it reminded him of her, untamed yet kind. As evening came, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. They ate by the fire again, the light soft on their faces. Wade told her stories from his soldier days, not the bloody ones, but the strange, quiet moments that came between battles. A comrade who played harmonica to calm his nerves, a stray horse that followed the camp for miles. How the stars looked bigger when you thought it might be your last night alive. She listened without interrupting, eyes fixed on him. When he finished, she said, "You speak of ghosts as if they're still here." "They are," he said simply. "They just don't talk much." That night, the sky turned the color of old gunmetal. Akacheta sat by the hearth, sewing a tear in Wade's coat. He watched her hands move, steady and deliberate. It struck him how quickly she had become part of this place, like she had always belonged here. The cabin, once hollow, now carried the sound of breathing, of quiet motion, of life. She looked up and caught him watching. "What?" He shook his head, smiling faintly. "Nothing. Just been a while since I heard anyone hum in this house." "Shetkin lady," she nodded slowly, her voice soft. "Silence can heal, but it can also kill." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The third sun rose behind a veil of heat and dust. By noon, the wind had turned wild again, carrying the smell of the desert, hot, dry, full of warnings. The horizon shimmered like a forge. Wade worked outside, tightening the corral gate, while Akacheta hauled water from the well. "Looks like another storm's coming," he said, squinting into the distance. She followed his gaze, her brow furrowed. "It's not a storm," she said quietly. "It's the earth holding its breath." He didn't know what she meant then, but he would soon enough. Inside, they ate their last meal before sunset. The stew was thin, but the air between them was full. Wade poured 2 cups of coffee, and for the first time, Akacheta didn't add sugar. She sat close to the fire, legs tucked beneath her, the flames painting her face in shades of amber. Wade sat across from her, the firelight catching the scars on his hands, the gray in his beard. The silence stretched long between them, comfortable, almost sacred. Finally, she spoke. "If I stay," she said, voice low and steady, "will you still be alone?" Wade looked at her for a long time, his eyes reflecting the fire. "If you stay," he said, "I won't be lonely. There's a difference." Akacheta's eyes softened. She reached for his hand, hesitated, then let her fingers rest against his. Neither spoke. The fire popped once, sending sparks dancing into the air. Outside, the wind began to howl. The dust storm rolled in fast from the horizon, dark as smoke, swallowing the land. The sound of it was like the earth growling awake. The horses in the barn cried out, hooves striking the wood. Wade stood, grabbing his coat. "I'll see to the animals," he said. "I'll help," she answered, already pulling her shawl around her shoulders. Together, they stepped into the storm. The wind tore at their clothes, the dust biting into their faces. Wade led the way to the barn, shouting over the roar, his hand gripping hers tight. Inside, they calmed the horses, tied the gate, and shut the doors against the gale. For a long time, they stood there in the half-dark. The smell of hay and sweat thickened the air. The storm screamed around them, but inside they were still. 3 suns had come and gone, each one burning a little of the past away. Wade looked at Akacheta, her hair tangled, her eyes fierce in the flickering light. In that moment, he understood something simple and solid as earth. He wasn't just waiting for the end anymore. He was waiting for whatever came next. Outside, the dust storm raged on, the first sign of the reckoning to come. The third morning broke clear and sharp. Not a whisper of wind moved across the plains, not even the dry creak of grass. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Wade Hollister stepped outside the cabin and looked toward the ridge. The dust from last night's storm had settled, and the sky was pale and endless again, washed clean by dawn. The calm felt wrong, too perfect, too still. He could feel the change in the air, the way an old soldier feels a battle before it comes. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the riders appeared. They came slow and silent, spread across the ridge in a straight line, shoulder to shoulder, not a circle this time. This was no siege, it was a judgment. 70 warriors, their horses painted with streaks of white and ash. Spears glinted in the sun, feathers fluttering like warnings. At their center rode Tyen, cloaked in the pelt of a gray wolf, his face streaked red down the middle like a scar of war. Akacheta saw them first. She stepped out onto the porch, shawl wrapped tight, her face unreadable. Wade joined her, rifle hanging loosely by his side, but muzzle pointed at the dirt. "They've come," she said quietly. "I know. They won't kill you right away," she added. "My father, he'll want to look you in the eye first." Wade nodded. "Then I'll make sure he sees what's worth looking at." As the warriors approached, their horses' hooves fell in perfect rhythm, like a heartbeat of the earth. When they stopped, Tyen dismounted and walked forward alone. The others stayed back, unmoving, their faces hidden behind war paint and shadow. Wade met him halfway, boots sinking into the wet earth where the snow had melted. The 2 men stopped a few yards apart, the air between them thick with things that couldn't be said. "You love her," Tyen said, his tone not accusing, but measuring. Wade's gaze didn't flinch. "I respect her," he replied. "That's rarer." Tyen's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Respect is a fine word for a man who took what was not his." "I didn't take her," Wade said. "She came to my door half dead. I gave her warmth. That's all." The chief studied him for a long, silent moment. "And yet she stayed." Wade shrugged faintly. "Maybe she wanted to." The corner of Tyen's mouth twitched, something between anger and curiosity. "Words are easy, hands tell the truth." He lifted his chin toward the hills behind them. "Come," he said, "we hunt. The land will judge which of us speaks truth." Wade hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding. He laid his rifle on the porch rail, grabbed his coat, and followed Tyen toward the horses. Akacheta stepped forward, alarm flickering across her face. "He's testing you," she whispered. "He means to see if your spirit holds." "Guess I better not disappoint him," Wade said, and mounted the spare horse the warriors had brought. They rode in silence for miles, the sound of hooves muffled by the damp earth. The air smelled of rain and pine sap. Tyan led the way, his wolf pelt trailing behind him, the younger warriors flanking them like shadows. Wade kept pace, watching the land change around them. Low ridges, frozen streams, patches of snow that glittered in the morning light. At last, Tyan raised his hand and the line halted. They had reached the edge of a canyon, where the trees thinned and the ground dropped into a narrow valley below. A herd of deer grazed near the far slope, unaware. The chief turned to Wade. "You hunt with her bow," he said. "If your hand shakes, the spirits will know." He handed Wade the long bow and a single arrow, Apache's bow. Wade turned it over in his hands, feeling the smooth curve of the wood, the familiar twist of the string she had taught him to braid. He hadn't used one since boyhood. He drew a breath, steadying himself. The world fell silent again. No wind, no sound, just the heartbeat of the land. He drew the bow, the wood creaking softly. The deer lifted their heads, alert, ears twitching. Then the arrow flew. It cut the air clean, slicing through distance and silence, and struck true. The largest buck stumbled, fell, and didn't rise again. Wade lowered the bow slowly. The sound of the shot echoed once through the canyon, then vanished. Tyan stood still, eyes unreadable. Then after a long pause, he nodded once. "You don't speak our tongue," he said, "but I understand you." He stepped forward, knelt by the fallen deer, and pressed his hand to its neck, a gesture of respect, not conquest. Wade did the same. For a moment, they knelt together in the mud, two men from different worlds sharing the oldest language there was, silence and death. When they rose, Tyan reached into his belt and drew out a knife, a long, narrow blade with a carved bone handle. The metal gleamed dull in the sun. He held it out to Wade. "This is not a weapon," he said. "It is a promise. A man does not win a daughter. He proves he can carry her soul." Wade hesitated, then took the knife. "And if I fail?" Tyan looked at him steadily. "Then the land will take her back." They stood there for a long while, the air thick with mist and breath. Wade sheathed the blade carefully, meeting the chief's eyes. "You'll find I ain't much for failing." Something changed in Tyan's expression then, a small crack in the wall of old anger. He gave a single nod, short and final. "Then we'll see." They rode back down the ridge in silence. The sun had climbed high, but the clouds were gathering again, heavy and gray. Apache was waiting outside the cabin when they returned, her eyes searching Wade's face for an answer. Tyan dismounted and handed her a strip of hide from the deer's flank. "Your man's hand did not tremble," he said. Her lips parted in surprise. Then he has earned a place among us," Tyan said. "Not as a brother, not as an enemy." He looked toward Wade. "As a man." Wade gave a small nod. "That's all I ever wanted to be." The chief turned back toward his riders. "We leave with the next wind." Apache stepped forward. "Will you come back?" Tyan's gaze softened just enough for her to see it. "When the land calls for me again. Until then, keep your fire strong." He mounted his horse, the wolf pelt rippling behind him, and the others followed, their figures fading into the dust and light until only the sound of hooves remained. Distant, rhythmic, like a heartbeat moving away. By late afternoon, the rain came. It started slow, a whisper against the roof, then grew steady, soaking the red earth until it glistened dark as blood. Wade stood on the porch, watching the drops slide down the rail. The world smelled of wet soil and cedar. Apache joined him, her shawl pulled close, eyes half closed as if listening to something deep beneath the rain. "He tested you," she said softly. He nodded. "We both passed, I reckon." She smiled faintly. "He gave you his knife?" "Yeah." Wade glanced down at the blade, its handle gleaming faintly in the gray light. "Guess that means something." "It means he believes you will keep your word," she said. He looked at her, his expression unreadable but gentle. "And what word's that?" She turned toward him, her eyes dark and steady. "To carry my soul." The rain fell harder, drumming against the roof, washing the dust from the world. Wade reached out and took her hand, not like a claim, but like an understanding. She didn't pull away. Outside, the land breathed again, cleansed by water and quiet. There was no blood spilled, no hate left to chase. Only the soft hiss of rain on red dirt, washing away the weight of old wars and the ghosts they'd carried too long. And for the first time in many years, Wade Hollister felt the ground beneath his boots, not as a battlefield, but as home. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn. By the time the first light touched the plains, Dry Hollow smelled alive again, of wet cedar, clean earth, and wood smoke. A thin plume rose from Wade Hollister's chimney, curling white against the pale sky. For years that smoke had meant loneliness, the kind that came from a man's silence and grief. But this morning, it meant something else. It meant breakfast, warmth, and life. Wade stood by the porch, breathing in the new air. The sky stretched clear for miles, washed blue after the storm. The mud on the path was already drying, and a pair of meadowlarks hopped across the fence line, chirping like they'd been waiting for this peace. Inside the cabin, Apache stirred a pot over the fire. The smell of corn and herbs filled the room, and the sound of her soft humming blended with the creak of the old timbers. When she turned, Wade was already watching her from the doorway. "Town day," he said simply, pulling on his hat. She nodded, wiping her hands on a cloth. "People will stare," he shrugged. "Let 'em. Ain't got much else to do in that town." By mid-morning, the two of them were riding side by side down the dirt road that led into Larkspur. The sky above was wide and gentle, the kind of blue that promised spring wasn't far off. Akacheda's dark hair whipped behind her, her shawl tied firm around her shoulders. Wade rode steady, his posture straight, his eyes calm. A man who'd finally stopped running from ghosts. As they neared the town, the silence between them changed. He could feel her tense beside him, the way her breathing deepened. She'd never been around this many white folks before, and he didn't blame her for feeling the weight of it. The first townspeople they passed stopped to stare. The blacksmith froze mid-swing. The saloon keeper leaned against the doorframe, wiping his hands on a rag. Akacheta kept her chin high, her eyes forward. Wade tipped his hat to no one in particular, as if daring them to speak. At the general store, he dismounted and tied the reins. "You wait here," he said quietly. She looked him dead in the eye. "No," she said. "I walk with you." Wade paused, then smiled just enough for her to see it. "All right, then." When they stepped through the door, the chatter inside stopped cold. Old Mrs. Green, who ran the counter, blinked like she'd seen a ghost. Akacheta stood beside Wade, shoulders straight, the morning light pouring through the doorway behind her. Wade placed a small list on the counter. "Coffee, sugar, and nails," he said. His voice was steady, low, carrying the weight of someone who didn't ask permission to exist. Mrs. Green hesitated, then cleared her throat. "And how are you, Mr. Hollister?" He looked around the quiet room, at the faces that had known his solitude for years. Then he said it plain, so every ear could hear, "We'll be married come spring." Gasps broke the silence. One man muttered something under his breath and left. Another dropped a coin on the floor and didn't bother to pick it up. But Wade didn't move. Akacheta turned to him, her eyes soft but fierce. "I am not a rescue," she said, her voice carrying clear and sure. "I am a choice." Wade smiled at her, then, not proud, not surprised, just deeply certain. "Yeah," he said quietly, "so am I." They rode home under a sun that glowed like polished copper. The storm had left puddles across the road, each one reflecting the sky. Akacheta rode ahead this time, her laughter carried by the wind, bright and light as the song of the plains. When they reached the cabin, Wade dismounted and helped her down. The earth smelled of rain and sage. The cottonwood by the creek shimmered with new buds. Mary's tree, reborn again. Wade set to work in the shed, pulling a block of oak from the pile. His hands moved slow and sure, the sound of his carving knife scraping soft against the grain. The rhythm of it filled the air like a heartbeat. Akacheta came to the doorway, watching him. "What are you making?" He didn't look up. "Something that ought to have been made a long time ago." She stepped closer. The shape was small, curved, cradled in his hands. It took her a moment to recognize it. the frame of a wooden cradle, smooth and strong. Her breath caught. "For what comes next?" she asked softly. He looked at her then, his eyes warm. "For whoever this world decides to give us." Akacheta smiled, her hand brushing against her belly without thinking. She felt the faintest flutter, like a whisper of wind beneath her ribs. The future had already begun. By sunset, the air was gold and still. The fields shimmered, damp and glowing. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and gentle. Not the lonely kind of fire Wade had tended for years, but a living one that filled the room with warmth. He sat at the table, the unfinished cradle beside him, the knife still resting on the wood. Akacheta moved behind him, her steps soft as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tell me," she said, "how your story began." He smiled faintly, the lines at his eyes deepening. "Some stories begin with war," he said, staring into the flames. "Ours began the night I opened that door." Akacheta knelt beside him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "And I walked in." Wade reached out and brushed his thumb along her jaw, his touch careful, reverent. "Reckon that's the part I'll remember when everything else fades." Outside, the wind moved through the valley, carrying the smell of rain and smoke. The land seemed to sigh, not weary, but content. Akacheta sat back, her gaze drifting toward the hearth. "Two fires," she said quietly. "One for what's gone, one for what stays." Wade looked at her, following her eyes to the flames. One burned high and bright, the other lower, steadier, like two hearts learning to breathe together. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he murmured, "the house of two fires." Later that night, after the fire had died down to embers, Wade stepped outside. The stars were fierce and clear, scattered across the heavens like nails driven into black velvet. The air still smelled of her, wild herbs, smoke, rain. He looked toward the creek, where Mary's resting place lay beneath the cottonwood. "I kept the promise, Mary," he whispered. "Didn't think I could, but I did." The wind stirred the branches overhead, and for a moment it almost sounded like a sigh, gentle, approving. When he turned back, Akacheta was standing in the doorway, wrapped in his old coat, her silhouette framed by the warm light behind her. "You talked to her," she said softly. "Yeah," Wade replied. "Old habits die hard." "She listens," Akacheta said, smiling faintly. "The earth remembers everything." He nodded. "Guess it does." She reached out her hand. "Come back inside, it's cold." He took her hand without a word, letting her pull him into the warmth. Inside, the fire flickered again, and the small cabin seemed larger than it ever had. The cradle waited in the corner, half finished but full of promise. Akacheta curled up beside him near the hearth, resting her head against his shoulder. The flames danced in the reflection of his eyes, one bright, one calm. And Wade realized something that made him smile through the quiet. For the first time since the war, since Mary's death, since the long silence of Dry Hollow, he wasn't afraid of the morning anymore. The night outside deepened, but inside that little wooden house, two fires burned side by side. One for memory, one for the life yet to come. And as the wind whispered across the valley, Dry Hollow finally found its peace. The silence that had once haunted it now felt like grace.